All right. Hello, everyone. Our applications live in complex systems with points of failure that span space and time. As developers, we write code that's executed in systems that we rarely know all the ins and outs of. And it would be a poor use of our time to try to anticipate all the ways in which our code can fail. And so the errors that our code raises gives us feedback when code paths that have some assumptions baked into them that require a little bit of re-examination. It's our superpower to make reasonable assumptions, let our tests guide us, but also ship fast and allow our systems to tell us the ways in which our system is falling down, instead of trying to predict those failures. This also means that sometimes we must put on our gear, step into our spaceships, and identify which invaders are going to cause us harm and which ones are okay to allow to stick around. We may all share this understanding of the importance of reacting to uncaught exceptions, and yet some of our processes, or lack thereof, can make this notification still elicit some dread. Welcome to Schrödinger's error, living in the gray area of exceptions. I'm Sweta Sanghavi. I'm a developer at BackerKit. And I've become really interested in why exceptions are so difficult to manage and what we can do about it. Today, I'm going to walk through some process experiments we've tried on my team at BackerKit and learnings we've surfaced. And then we're all going to go on to triage duty together and see some tools we can use to help us when we're managing exceptions. All right, put on your helmets and your space boots. Keep your arms inside the vehicle at all times. So I'm going to lay some groundwork of where we started. At BackerKit, we support creators in fulfilling their crowdfunding projects. If you've backed a crowdfunding campaign, you may have gotten your survey through BackerKit. Take a look at that URL. We're a pretty small, lean team. Our daily flow is to pair up in the morning and work down a backlog or a queue of features, chores, and bugs. We surfaced a problem that though we had a general idea there's utility to reacting to impactful exceptions, we weren't super effective at doing so. When we started thinking more critically about this, we had a pretty light process for addressing exceptions. We had a Slack integration that surfaced any unresolved or unignored errors that went to a channel. And since we were usually pairing, someone who was either soloing or had a spare moment may look at the channel and notice when there was something worth addressing. But one, it required context switching from our prioritized queue work, and there was no owner or designated dev. And so it ended up being a few folks who were in there regularly and a lot of folks who weren't really looking in that channel. We also had a pretty low alignment of what process we wanted to use for managing exceptions, and not a shared goal of what effective management was and which exceptions were high priority in addressing, or what actions to take in response. There was a pretty large backlog of errors, and so it was hard to scan it quickly or really surface when there was something that should be addressed coming up. And so we started to experiment with some process changes to get better at exception management. Our first experiment was Badger duty, affectionately called. We use Honeybadger as our observability tool, and so Badger Patrol, Badger duty was the experiment where each of us owned managing exceptions for the week and tracking, and you could either solo or pair on it, and tracking how long it took to triage and address any important exceptions. This was our first stab at starting to chip away at the errors and also to de-silo exception management. As we were all becoming more exposed to exception management, we started to surface what our pain points were and why this was difficult for our team. One was the priority was unclear. It was unclear when something was urgent, when we were just scanning exceptions. And when compared to our high-value feature work, it could feel like low value to be managing or triaging exceptions. Internally, we weren't super aligned on what those high-priority exceptions were. There were also a lot of exceptions that had low actionability, nor did we have a well-aligned path to what we should be doing about it. And so it could lead to feeling a little stuck when we came across an exception. We also started surfacing that we weren't aligned on what the goal was. And so kind of our takeaways at this first experiment was that having this process helped us start to have a place to iterate from. Actually, just having something that we know we were doing did ease some of the anxiety of not knowing who was tackling this. And it gave us a process to start unearthing where we weren't aligned. We started to realize that getting aligned on our goals would be a useful exercise as we kept iterating on this. Also, Badger Duty kind of gave us a place, like when we were pairing or working on an exception, to start digging for finding where we were disagreeing, which is actually the first piece to starting to align. So I'm going to go through some of the goals we landed on as a team. Our first goal was that we should be able to see signal through noise when we are managing exceptions. It should be clear when there's something that should be addressed, and it should surface through or surface above the rest of maybe the more noisy exceptions. A piece of this means tackling some of that noise so that the signals can kind of come through. Our goal is not to get 0 exceptions or never raise exceptions or inbox 0. And it's also not to like find fires. Monitoring is where we expect those kinds of things to come through. We also had the goal of having a collective ownership of addressing exceptions. We saw a lot of utility for all of us to be exposed to what the exceptions that were happening in the app. It allowed for all of us to be involved in making the solutions and benefiting from other people's perspectives or what they found, or perhaps if they were closer to that piece of the code base. It was an opportunity for knowledge share. And last, our goal was to proactively address exceptions. This may be a shared goal of we should see when there's some unfavorable user impact, or if a user's gotten themselves into a state that they can't get themselves out of, before that we get those user reports. So that's like the utility of our exception management. And so we proposed another process change. The next thing we tried is a rotating pair, triaging exceptions daily. This had the benefit, again, to having a clear owner, so it wasn't like all the team was expected to look at the Slack or check in on what's going on. It also allowed us, because this was a rotating designation, it allowed us to make resource decisions at the top of the day, looking at schedules or looking at high priority work, who is going to work on bugs, and also do we have the bandwidth to do so. Again, everyone was exposed to the nuances of exception management and the exceptions that were coming through our app, which allowed us to drive towards alignment. As different people came across the same exceptions and why they were painful, we could discuss them and come up with solutions to incorporate the team's ideas. I'm going to go through what it looks like to be on triage duty at BackerKit. First, at the top, you start at the top of the backlog of the unaddressed errors at the top of the backlog. You get a 15-minute time box. Your goal in that 15 minutes is to determine the priority of that bug. It basically boils down to 3 options. This is something that should be fixed, but I'm not going to do it right now because I have 15 minutes. So I'm going to write a bug ticket and put it in the bug section of our sprint, of our backlog. I'm going to acknowledge it. So we sort of came up with the idea of acknowledgement, but it's pretty similar to resolve. The idea being, I've looked at it. This is not something we need to really do anything about. Acknowledge and move on. I do want to know the next time it happens. Or this is something that's worth fixing, and it's worth fixing now. I'm going to make a bug ticket, and I'm going to work on it now for really high priority exceptions. A tool that we use to support bug duty is a dashboard. So what this helped us do is to get a quick idea of what exceptions had not been addressed. This is pretty much pulling those same errors that we saw in our Slack integration into a more user-friendly UI. It also really supported this like going down the line of triaging, starting at the top and going down, and you get some useful information just from at a glance. This also supported some of those resource decisions of like, how deep is our backlog? How important is it to make sure someone's looking at exceptions today? I also wanted to talk about the idea of acknowledgement that you can see in BadgerBot. So the purpose of Acknowledge, as I spoke about before, is to kind of say, we're not going to do something about this. As part of our process, we also started auto-resolving weekly. So basically, an acknowledgement would expire in a week, and so you would see the error again. You can see the drop-down that comes down when you hit Acknowledge. And you can see what this kind of represents is us starting to bucket why we might be acknowledging exceptions, which actually ends up being really useful as you're having conversations about the priority of different exceptions. You can see, like, yeah, there's this get timeout, but it's not high priority, or it's not in high frequency. I'm going to move on. Also, some things about, like, I already see a story about this. I'm not going to make a new one. And also, you could keep adding new choices that you wish were here that are not. So it kind of allows us to have a way forward for what I think is starting to talk about the gray area of, like, yes, I want to see this exception. No, I don't want to do anything about it. And, like, being comfortable with that designation and knowing that there are many exceptions that are going to live in that bucket. Next, I want to start talking about some learnings from this next process change that we made. One big one, especially for me, was that exceptions can be solved collectively over time. When you have a 15-minute time box, you're likely hitting it frequently, which means that you have to kind of think about, what can I do in 15 minutes that's going to move debugging this exception forward? It really reframed how I thought about what it means to fix something, because sometimes it can mean that I don't think this is high enough value for me to spend time really digging into this, but maybe next time I wish that I had this piece of information. I'm going to add it to the breadcrumbs or the params. Other kinds of small things you can do, like refactoring out a law of Demeter violation so that next time the line from which the error was thrown is more useful. Or just, like, starting a bug ticket and having a place to log what's going to happen next time, and being okay with allowing it to happen again and letting all of that be more data points to support a broader solution. It also allows you to try something right now and push forward the exception for the next person to take over next time, and start putting patterns into our app for dealing with exceptions that we were seeing a lot of. Another learning is about prioritizing and writing bug stories. Writing bug stories that I myself would actually want to pick up is quite the art. Providing enough context for the next person about what you've discovered, but not allowing, like, any half-baked theories to be in the ticket is really useful and can be difficult. Things that were useful for us is, like, links to faults, how to reproduce that same exception, or other information you uncovered. One way to really prove to yourself that you understand why an exception is being raised is to write a test that shows the same system that you think is causing this exception and seeing that failing test, which is a really great thing to link to a bug ticket. One other learning from our triage duty kind of process is that we started making a lot of bug tickets, but weren't always picking them up, and so our bug backlog also grew. And so another addition to this process was pulling a set number of bugs over each sprint. This kind of alludes to, like, when you want to tackle your backlog, you have to have that investment, and you do have to prioritize those bugs, and make room in your sprint for them. It also serves as a purpose of, if no one is advocating for certain bugs to get into the sprint, maybe they weren't that important, and letting them fall off can also be a really useful tool. Another learning is, if you look at your top occurring errors, you might find that it usually follows a power law, and the top several are probably going to take up a chunk of the exceptions. And so making a deliberate effort to start chipping away at those can be really useful. And last learning is identifying the levers for efficiency. We kind of had this general goal of triaging quicker and moving faster, and this process started to show us what was taking a long time. Exceptions require you to load up a lot of context really quickly. And I think exposing us more to triage duty regularly and building that muscle was really useful in us moving faster. Also having more paths to actionability, which ended up being one of the reasons why it was going so slow. we are going to move on to triage duty. So I've pulled 2 errors out of our app, and I want to actually go through the process of triaging them together. So the first is this Faraday timeout error that we see is being thrown from the project lead fetcher. First step, understanding the error. We see here it's a net read timeout. If the error that you're seeing is not something you're familiar with, really familiarize yourself with the error code, or if the HTTP status is new to you, what it really means. And if it's a custom error, looking into the API and understanding when that error is thrown. In our case, we see that we have a net read timeout, a subclass of the timeout error, which is raised when a chunk of the response can't be read within the read timeout that you've set, the default of which being 60 seconds. Just for a little refresher, we know when we're making an HTTP request, we open up our TCP connection, send a request over the wire, and then read the response back. What our error is telling us is that that last step is not happening. I bring that up because you might view it differently if it's a GET or a POST. In our POST request, we really want to know, did we send something over the wire or not? And in this case, we do have to check, versus if you were unable to open the connection at all. Next step, let's understand the call site and what this piece of code was meant to do that it was unsuccessful at doing. We can see that this error is being thrown from a GET method in our client with our Indiegogo integration. If we look at our backtrace, we can look down and see, OK, there's a GET campaign method that was expecting to be able to get some information. It's being thrown from our project lead fetcher worker. All right, so we're starting to get some information. Whatever project lead fetcher needed campaign information for, it is unsuccessful at doing that. We might then look at where this worker is being called from to understand more about the purpose of this code. I've done some digging for us, and we can see that it's coming from a staff controller action called sync from a method sync and update. So again, we're starting to get some more information like, oh, this is a staff action that is exposed. This is a GET request. So some information that we expect to have, we did not, and we also know it's coming from something that is exposed to a user. So theoretically, they could kick the worker off again. The next question is, how often is this happening? So we see that it's 67 occurrences in the last 4 months. This is not new. It's not super frequent, so it's not super noisy. It can be useful just to ask yourself, is this something that's gone out in a recent deploy, and maybe that will change how likely you are to fix it, et cetera. And also just gives us an idea of how noisy it is. Some other tools for debugging that you might use is to just kick off the process again. In our case, I kicked this off when I was debugging, and hey, the next time we did it, we were successful. Try to reproduce the error, and also like finding patterns and past occurrences of the error can be really useful. So now let's think about priority. And this, again, there is no equation. I wish I could give one to you, but it's an art. 2 things that you might consider is the frequency. As we talked about, we want to reduce the noise. And so things that have high frequency, even if the user impact is low, it might change our priority of addressing that exception or not seeing it again. User impact is the other big one. We want our users to have really great experiences. And so considering what was the impact for the downstream user, you might have a higher priority for a page timing out and a user not being able to do something. If it's affecting even more users, that also might change your appetite for making a change. So in our example, we see pretty low frequency. And we also know that the user has a way to get themselves out of this information, and they're missing some data they expect to have. All right, so let's think about what we could do in this case. We see that, as we talked about, the read timeout is something we've configured. You could change this. This would be a pretty global change. That's an option, though. You can use a retry. You can rescue this error and retry and be like, I don't want to see this. Try once more before you throw an exception. We can acknowledge it. We can say, hey, this is something that happens in our app. We are working with web requests. They are going to be flaky. We could snooze. We could say, not only do I not care about this time, I don't want to see it for another 100 times. Or we could handle this case if it's representing some specific user flow. In this case, we've kind of determine low user impact, low frequency, seems like a really good candidate to dismiss and move on. Good job, y'all. We've solved our first exception of triage duty. Let's move on to the second one. All right, next in our queue is the missing correct access error from the project fetcher worker. We know our first step is understanding the error, so missing correct access, that's not an error I really know off the bat. So I'm gonna look at the call set and be like, what, can you tell me more about this error? And I see this is actually a custom error that we've thrown. Someone at one point was like, I don't wanna see 403s, I wanna raise this error that tells you more about what's going on, this missing correct access. Another utility of having a custom error is that you can kind of throw it from different places in the app so we can build an understanding when it's the same root cause. Let's move on to what the purpose of this code is. We have this ID, we have this custom error, missing correct access. Maybe we're starting to understand what that means. We can look at the stack trace and see, again, there's a worker, project fetcher worker. It is trying to get project information, and we're seeing this error that we're raising. We might need some more information about what the purpose of this worker is, like where was it called? And our root call site here is just Sidekick, not super useful. In the case for workers, because it is being thrown from Sidekick, it can be difficult to know what where this is called. So one tool to help you do that is just putting what is calling the worker in params. So breadcrumbs and params are a really good tool. Another thing that could be useful is to save queries for post requests to help you debug, or any other information that you wanted when you were debugging. Throwing it in the breadcrumbs or params could be really useful. So someone already has done us our favor. We can look at params and we can see, okay, there's a project update task that is calling this worker that is causing this exception. So I look in a Heroku scheduler and I see, oh, cool, this update task runs every day. So it'll just fix itself tomorrow, right? The thing is, if it's gonna raise again, it's also gonna throw that exception. So let's try kicking it off again. I see that it's idempotent. I try it again, and okay, this error is still happening. I still get a missing correct access. And what that means for our frequency is it's a pretty noisy error. We see that it's being raised most days. And if we think about triage duty, that means every day someone's going to be triaging this exception, which is painful. And so when we're thinking about this error, another part that I'm going to tell you is that this is raised when we integrate with Kickstarter and when our users are incorrectly authed into this external service. This is when we get this error. Which also means there's not much as a dev I can do. I can't really auth them for them. I don't have their credentials. But it's really noisy, which is maybe the worst of both worlds. This is an exception that I'm just going to sit there and be like, cool, here it is again. And we integrate with Kickstarter a lot. So you're going to see this error in any other action this user is trying to do on our app. So what can we do? How do we reduce the noise of low-value exceptions to support our goal of only high-valuable, actionable errors in our backlog? One tool we can do is just error grouping. Honey Badger by default groups exceptions by the type of error and where it's thrown from, but you can redefine a fingerprint to throw the same error from two different places when you know that's the same root cause. There's a gotcha there where it can affect some statistics or comments, but it can be a useful tool. Other things we can do is the rescue retry pattern. We know in this case it's not really going to help us because we know we're going to keep seeing it. If it has low actionability and you kind of question, is this even an exception we could see? Silencing it can be a really useful tool, actually. We don't want things in our observability tool that we can't do much about, or it doesn't help to know that it's happening. We can surface errors to users and allow them to be self-serviceable, train teams and processes with a manual workaround. Remember, our staff, our people who work with us are part of our system. Or if it's widespread and affecting a specific sliver, maybe an overlooked data consideration, you might actually fix that data. I want to show one thing that we did for this case. As I said, you can't do a lot of things in our app if you're not authed in correctly. And so we introduced this idea of a valid platform credential, which allows you to have an object to check on to check if something's valid, and allows you to have a check before you even run a process that you know is just going to throw an exception down the road. We also complemented this with a worker that would update valid platform credential. I was so interested in exceptions and how other people handled them that I sent out a survey before my talk to understand some other pain points, et cetera. And I was going to share them with you here. But as you can tell, we're pretty close to time, and I kind of ran out of time. What I'm going to do is have an exception tip or of the week on my Twitter. My handle is down there. Look out for that if you are going to, or if you're interested. I actually also learned a bunch of things just from folks at RubyConf, so I'm super excited to dive deeper into here. Thank you all for joining me on this voyage. Please collect all your belongings on your way out. If you have any questions, please come find me outside or ask me on Discord. And if you try anything, please @ me on Twitter. I'd love to know how it went for you. I want to thank my coworkers who continuously inspire me to keep experimenting. Ian and Lindsay are here right now. Ian was the originator of BadgerBot, so if you want to talk to him, you should. I also want to give a shout out to the WMB-CFP working group who gave me a ton of feedback and helped me on this whole process. Would not be here without you. And my parents who flew here, my dad who's in the crowd right now, would also not be there without him. Thanks, everyone. Last slide, I had to shout out BackerKit. If you're interested in TDD, experimentation, crowdfunding, come talk to us. We're hiring. Thanks, everyone.